The opposite of nature is impossible. How our adversarial relationship with life undermines even our best intentions. What I hope to convey in this presentation is twofold. The first is that humans in contemporary society view nature as an adversary to be brought under our control, usually through suppressive and destructive means. We draw the technical swords from our sheaths and fight a never-ending and fruitless battle against the very forces that support and nurture us. This adversarial posturing, unfortunately, undermines our very best intentions, from our battle against hunger to our war against degenerative disease. But as visionary mathematician and designer Buckminster Fuller observed, the opposite of nature is impossible. The second thing I hope to show is that the fire that inflames many of our ills is lit from a single match, our adversarial approach to life, and what appear to be diverse problems share a common solution, shifting our point of view. When the laws of nature are understood and correctly applied, a plurality of physical, social, environmental, even political ills will respond favorably to the exact same corrective measures. In short, we don't always have to choose our battles. Sometimes we just need to shift our point of view. So, another presentation on climate change. By now, you've been exposed to the doom and gloom forecasts of climate change, and each day, the news just gets worse. It never gets better. The grim statistics get forever upwardly revised. It's a wonder that you can even bring yourself to yet one more presentation on the subject. But in today's talk, I can offer you a more optimistic, perhaps manageable, view on climate change and your role in it. A brief mention of why I decided to create this presentation. I was serving in a sustainability role at a learning center in the northeastern United States. The CEO of the center decided to hold a series of meetings on sustainability to be facilitated by a world-renowned expert on the subject. In attendance would be top management of the organization, including select members of its board of directors. After introductions were offered, and before the start of the day's agenda, a spouse of one of the managers who had been invited to attend offered to the group what he claimed to be a, quote, clever catchphrase to describe the cynicism he felt that we, and the world at large, could ever achieve anything of substance to alleviate the effects of climate change. I never heard what that clever catchphrase was. I vaguely remember people laughing and nodding their heads, but I felt I'd been hit by a train by his suggestion that I was about to embark on a journey and be obliged to work with people who established as their baseline cynicism as it related to the task at hand. I never heard what that clever catchphrase was because my heart was pounding and the blood was rushing through my ears. Now, I should have excused myself in the meeting right then and there and taken my leave in order to compose myself in the hallway before rejoining the group. I was clearly not in control of my emotional response to the gentleman's words and his defeatist attitude. But instead, I opened my mouth and firmly planted first one foot and then the other inside. A word of advice: never react by telling your superiors, including a board of directors, the CEO, and a nationally recognized speaker, that they're all arrogant. Although I likely lost my job that day early on in my position, I did have another 2 years to articulate my views on the subject of climate change, natural law, and human initiative. But what was it about those gentlemen's words that troubled me so? There was a degree of cynicism that absolutely blindsided me. But in the words of that great philosopher Colbert, Stephen Colbert, cynicism masquerades as wisdom, but cynicism is a self-imposed blindness. You put the blinders on yourself to protect yourself from a world that you think might disappoint you. Be a fool. Believe things will be good. And here's the thing about cynicism. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, it's more likely that the challenges seemed too daunting for the gentleman and he wasn't simply up to the task. And that's a feeling shared by many people, including myself at times. But cynicism is a luxury of thought that we cannot afford at this time. As has been oft repeated, we are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change, yet we are the last one that can do something about it. Perhaps there's also a lack of faith that we can create the technology in time, but again, here's the thing. The technology already exists. In fact, we don't even drive technology. Technology drives us. And what do I mean by that? Let me provide two examples. World around, stone tools were first developed approximately 3 million years ago. Fire was brought under control about 1.5 million years ago. There's evidence of cooking as far back as 250,000 years. Agriculture was first developed about 23,000 years ago. The first evidence of pottery shows up about 20,000 years. The domestication of animals was thought to begin around 11,000 BC, and metal tools were first forged in 4,000 BC. Now I'm guessing that humans stumbled upon some of these discoveries, such as the domestication of fire and perhaps cooking, when a raw piece of meat was inadvertently dropped into, then retrieved from a fire. And while development of these arts, agriculture, the domestication of animals, the development of pottery and shelters, required individual and even group initiative, is there a force at work that's larger than any one person or tribe? It seems that world around, these discoveries evolved at roughly the same time without evidence of human contact between groups. Indeed, in most cases, it would have been impossible. And then there's the principle of precession. During its first weeks of formation, a chick is provided with all the nutrition it requires inside its shell. As it develops, though, it eventually exhausts its supply of nourishment, or fuel. It begins pecking feverishly in search for more, thus creating an opening in its shell and giving birth to itself. This is what Buckminster Fuller describes as precession, when animals, seemingly inadvertently, but by nature's design, are provided for in all stages of development to ensure not only their individual survival, but the survival of the species. Now, humans, too, are included in this elegant design. Like that chick, we also find ourselves inside our shell with dwindling resources, specifically centuries-old combustion-based technologies that have not only outlived their usefulness, but today degrade all forms of life. And, like that chick, we have been led, again seemingly inadvertently, but by nature's design, to the next stage of our evolution, the discovery and development of unlimited, clean sources of power. But unlike that chick, we're not compelled to leave our shell and embrace this next stage of growth. We can actually choose to remain inside with dwindling resources. Why? I suspect it's because of our semi-divine nature. That is, we are both blessed and cursed with the ability to exercise free will. As humans, we find ourselves operating at a level of consciousness above that of the lowest forms of life, which live out their lives in predictable and easily recognizable fashion, but below what R.J. Campbell describes as the spontaneous exuberance of the angels. What this means, among other things, is that of the 1.25 million species of animals on this planet, humans are the only ones capable of self-destructive choices. We're that smart. We're that clever. But this freedom to act, even on our worst impulses, is a condition necessary for our personal and social growth, and we rise and fall by it daily as individuals and as a society. The environmental challenges set squarely before us today are not technological in nature, but rather social and spiritual. What has caught us by surprise is the explosion of new technologies and the acceleration in the development of them, beginning with the Industrial Revolution. Here we have two photos, and if you'll notice the smokestacks in both indicating the same position on the road, but photos taken 50 years apart. On the lower left-hand side is a gentleman with a horse and buggy, the technology of which went relatively unchanged for thousands of years. But in 50 short years later, we transition from 1 horsepower to 32 million horsepower Saturn I booster that launched the astronauts to the moon. Again, only 50 years later. Specifically, we were for the good part of this time unaware of the nature of side effects of these technologies. That is to say, it was a lot easier burning coal than understanding the science behind it. Some of these side effects include 570 billion pounds of municipal waste produced in the United States each year. 4 billion pounds of toxic chemicals released into the atmosphere. 2 trillion pounds of livestock waste, laced with antibiotics, hormones, and chemicals, are dumped into our waterways and applied to our land. Each of us carries an average of 700 industrial chemicals within our bodies. 40% of U.S. waterways fail to meet minimum clean water standards. Over 70% of all biodiversity on the planet has now been lost. The Environmental Working Group commissioned 5 labs to examine the umbilical cord blood of 10 babies and found the presence of 232 synthetic chemicals. Now, this is the umbilical cord blood. These are the building blocks of our children. Some of these chemicals included BPA, which is a hormone disruptor, TBBPA, which is found in computer circuit boards, synthetic fragrances used in cosmetics and detergents, chemicals from common household cleaners. Looking back over our shoulders at the entire span of millions of years of human evolution, it was but a little over 50 years ago when scientist and writer Rachel Carson introduced us to the science of ecology, that branch of biology dealing with the relations and interactions between organisms and their environment. The idea I want to express here might at first seem contrary to common sense, but understanding what I'm about to suggest will likely turn your assumptions about climate change and how to mitigate its effects upside down. Think of what I am pointing out as uncommon sense. There is, in nature, no such thing as side effects. They simply don't exist. All effects in nature are main effects. No side effects at all. And this is really good and hopeful news. Allow me to explain this in a bit more detail. The myth of side effects. Now, everything created by man first exists as a universal principle, which is perfect in nature, but imperfectly worked out by humans. Our present-day technologies are based upon natural principles, but they're imperfectly worked out by us, and I'll provide examples of this. Now, these technologies are easy to recognize because they produce what we mistakenly view as side effects. Climate change is the accumulation of side effects from our imperfect technologies. And I don't mean to reduce climate change to such a simplistic formula, but I believe that there's truth in this. Climate change is simply the accumulation of side effects, so-called side effects, from our imperfect technologies. So we have to perfect our technologies. And in truth, we are. And I'll provide just a few examples of that a bit later on. So let's look at some of these so-called side effects. There's the production of energy that's perfect in nature. As an example, the leaf. The leaf produces energy through photosynthesis, where leaves transmute carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight into carbohydrates and energy. There are no side effects, and the only waste product, and there is no such thing as waste in nature as well, but the only so-called waste products from the process of photosynthesis is, well, oxygen. Now the production of energy imperfectly worked out by man. There is credible evidence indicating that humans domesticated fire as far back as 1.5 million years ago. Ever since that time, humans have relied upon combustion-based energy, wood, coal, oil, gas, to first heat their dwellings and cook their food, and then to heat, cool, electrify their homes and businesses, drive their machinery, and propel their vehicles, trains, automobiles, planes, rockets. The so-called side effects of combustion-based technologies and fossil fuels include, but they're not limited to, land degradation and the loss of critical wildlife habitat, water pollution, acid runoff from coal mining, the use of 9.6 million gallons of water per well for our 1.1 million active fracking wells, turning it into wastewater containing heavy metals, radioactive materials, and other pollutants, and then releasing it back into our waterways. Everything created by man first exists as a universal principle which is perfect in nature, but imperfectly worked out by us. Toxic emissions produced in the extraction, transportation, and processing of fossil fuels. Global warming from the burning of fuels that releases heat-trapping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and oceans. Coal-fired power plants that generate 40% of the mercury emissions in the United States, as well as 2/3 of U.S. sulfur dioxide emissions, which contribute to acid rain. Ocean acidification, disrupting its entire food chain, loss of species, and decimating its habitats. And the emissions from cars, trucks, trains, boats, planes. Everything created by man first exists as a universal principle, which is perfect in nature, but imperfectly worked out, imperfectly understood by us. And this is just the beginning in terms of cascading side effects. We have to include the cost of environmental cleanup, the medical costs related to health issues arising from these side effects, the loss of plant and animal diversity, the costs of maintaining a war footing to secure sources of fossil fuels, $6 trillion alone since the year 2000, and the inability to otherwise invest in health care, child care, education, investments, and new technologies. The fire we domesticated 1.5 million years ago is now all-consuming, from the hills of California to the Australian bush to the forests of the Amazon and the slow cooking of our seas. It's no longer a controlled burn. Now, for the first time in 1.5 million years, humanity can finally wean itself off of its dependence upon fire and the use of combustion-based technologies. Perfecting our power production through our growing understanding of natural principles, we can create technology that produces no side effects. That would mean universal principles which are perfect in nature and perfected by mankind. Solar power, wind power, tidal energy, geothermal. No side effects. The treatment of human waste. Just as there are no side effects in nature, there's also no waste products as well. Humans alone have the intelligence to ignore or try to act contrary to natural laws. As a consequence, our species alone produces waste as a side effect of imperfect technologies. Look at the typical forest floor. Season after season, year in and year out, leaves Foliage die, fall to the forest floor and decay. Twigs, branches, trunks, all flora, including all fauna, from microscopic animals to the larger species of mammals. They'll die, they'll decay, they'll be recycled, they will feed into the life system. Death begats life. No waste, no side effects. Treatment of human waste. In wastewater, again, we're employing natural laws that are imperfectly worked out by man. An Associated Press investigation found that more than 270 million pounds of pharmaceutical compound residue is dumped every year into American waterways, many of which serve as drinking water for millions of citizens. Most of the drugs we consume pass through the body unused and are discharged into our water system as well. Many of the more than 4,000 prescription medications used for human and animal health ultimately will find their way into the environment, from antibiotics and anticonvulsants to antidepressants, mood stabilizers, sex hormones. 2 trillion pounds of animal waste generated by large-scale poultry and livestock operations is laced with hormones and antibiotics, fed to animals to make them grow faster and keep them from getting sick while fed an unsuitable diet and inhumane living conditions. These, too, make their way into our estuaries and groundwater, and our bodies. Add to this chemical cocktail the effluents from household and business sinks and toilets, industrial runoff, petroleum products, strong acids. And while chlorine does effectively kill many pathogens in the water, this toxic chemical is not removed before we drink it. In addition, we have to consider that in this country we produce 75,000 to 85,000 chemicals that are not regulated or tested for safety. As one example of municipal drinking water, the Philadelphia municipal drinking water system was found to contain over 50 carcinogenic chemicals, including personal care products. But Philadelphia is by no means the exception. Our municipal treatment systems, while effectively neutralizing most pathogens, are not built to remove most of the effluents and none of the pharmaceuticals. Again, natural laws imperfectly worked out by man. But there is a better way. Let's take our lessons from nature. What you're looking at is the Eco Machine at the Omega Center for Sustainable Living in Rhinebeck, New York. The Eco Machine is a natural water treatment system, and it is an example of universal principles which are perfect in nature and perfectly worked out by man. Now, this system is designed to purify up to 57,000 gallons of what we commonly refer to as wastewater, water that flows from Omega's kitchens, showers, and toilets. What you see is a photo of 4 cement bases, each measuring 50 square feet. These basins receive the wastewater, and instead of being filled with soil, they are filled in instead with gravel. Planted in the gravel are bulrushes, cattails, sedges, along with whatever seeds that birds and the wind deposit over time. Instead of drawing its nourishment from soil, these plants will begin the process of breaking down the wastewater and pulling out the nutrients. In short, within 36 hours of having flushed the toilet, through a system of artificial wetlands and an indoor lagoon of tropical plants, the water is purified back into its natural state without the use of chemicals of any kind, simply with the introduction of bacteria found in nature. This water is then reintroduced into the underwater aquifer from where it was initially drawn. The hydrologic loop is complete, in full respect and in recognition of natural law. Having heard reports that cattails in the wild were known to pull some chemicals out of the lake and pond water, I worked with the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies to conduct a test on the wastewater entering the Eco Machine. We tested for the presence of 17 pharmaceuticals and personal care products, among them 7 varieties of antibiotics antidepressants, anti-seizure medication, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, DEET, Tylosin. Of the 17, we found 16 entering the system in detectable amounts. Halfway through the natural water purification system, they could no longer be found. Perhaps the plants had drawn these chemicals out of the water. Perhaps they had broken these drugs down in a more elemental form. Further study was required to learn the fate of these chemicals, and that work is being done at other similar systems. But these chemicals were effectively removed from the water and would not re-enter the aquifer. Another photo, the indoor lagoons, where the water purification continued over a 36-hour period. And that's yours truly on the lower right-hand corner, teaching a grade school class on biomimicry. So let's look at diet and the myth of side effects. Our entire approach to food and diet is based upon an unquestioned assumption that undermines our health. Even so-called authorities on nutrition misunderstand one of the most fundamental aspects about diet and health. We, humans, have evolved over hundreds of thousands of generations under conditions of natural sunlight, pure water, and unadulterated whole foods. Environmental influences that range over such a vast span of time has shaped us, both inside and out, like the hands of a master sculptor. The very essence of who we are has been defined by that relationship. Any deviation at all from this natural order invites a measure of stress and, eventually, disease. We need to recognize that all animals, in their natural habitats, evolved with foods perfectly suited for their needs to maintain health and natural resistance. Bees have their nectar. Deer have their browse. Birds have their seeds and berries. Unlike humans, every single food an animal eats in the wild is completely suited for it, benefiting it in countless ways, and most importantly, harming it in none. That's to say, there are no side effects from the foods that animals eat in the wild. Now, the modern dietary approach is to justify eating a food because it contains perhaps one or two ingredients considered to be essential for our health. As an example, meat. Meat, as you know, is recommended for its protein. Simple enough, but is that oversimplification? As with all foods recommended for human consumption that are not really suitable for health, meat comes with its own list of side effects. Overcooked meat. HCAs, PHAHs are chemicals formed when muscle meat, including beef, pork, fish, poultry, is cooked using high-temperature methods. In lab experiments, HCAs and PAHs have been found to be mutagenic. That is, they cause changes in DNA that may increase the risk of cancer. So that's overcooked meat. What about undercooked meat? They found the presence of E. coli, salmonella, listeria, trichinosis, or toxoplasmosis infections. Then there's eating too much meat. It contributes to type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, stroke, and certain cancers. So the advice is, don't undercook your meat, don't overcook your meat, don't eat too much of it. Now, does this sound like suitable food? Improper diet equals side effects. The milk is recommended for its calcium. As with all foods recommended for human consumption that are not really suitable for health, dairy foods come with their own list of side effects, which include Crohn's disease, allergies and asthma, ear infections, colic and constipation, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, various cancers from breast cancer to prostate. This is to say, these are the side effects of an imperfect diet. Just as with all other forms of life, foods suited for human consumption have no side effects at all. This is why mother's milk provides complete nutrition to the infant, and why cow's milk provides complete nutrition to the calf. No side effects. The modern dietary approach is to justify eating a food, as I said, because it contains one or two ingredients considered to be essential for our health. But really, based upon this belief, we could justify eating almost anything, because you'll always find something in a food item, any food item, essential for health. No other animal eats this way. No other animals suffer from side effects from eating this way, except, of course, for those animals that we domesticate and whose natural diet we eliminate. Annual expenditures on treating heart disease are on track to reach $800 billion by 2030, which doesn't take into account over $275 billion annually on the indirect costs of heart disease, such as lost productivity, which puts us over $1 trillion annually for that one lifestyle choice alone. Add to that projections for treating type 2 diabetes, projected to cost $500 billion this year alone. And throw in for good measure the $2.3 trillion spent annually by our healthcare system. Domesticated animals experience the same rates of degenerative disease and illness. Now, it's now common knowledge that many of today's leading and expensive health problems can be slowed, halted, even reversed through dietary and lifestyle changes. These illnesses include obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and many forms of cancer. Smoking and the excess consumption of alcohol, refined sugar, dietary fats are behind millions of chronic and acute illnesses in the United States each year. And the cost of treating these illnesses is crippling, physically, emotionally, and financially. Such are the side effects of foods ill-suited for regular human consumption. Natural laws that are perfect in nature, but imperfectly worked out by man. As we select foods perfectly suited for human consumption, a plurality of illnesses will respond favorably to the exact same corrective measures, and they will begin to diminish across the board simultaneously. Nature is beneficent. Nature is forgiving. Nature possesses remarkable self-healing mechanisms. It is always trying to mend, despite our best efforts to inhibit it. Humans are analytical. Nature is not. Physiology, botany, physics. Like taking a hammer to a rock, we shatter our world into pieces and study the individual shards. Chemistry, biology, nutrition. We compartmentalize because in order to study a subject, we must distinguish it from all else. But these are arbitrary boundaries that we set for the sake of simplicity in study. We do the same with our personal and social problems. Degenerative diseases, industrial pollution, problems associated with modern agriculture and human health. We regard them and treat them as distinct, independent concerns. But again, the borders we construct around our ill-defined problems are also artificial and arbitrary. These are mental, not physical parameters that we can adjust at will. And to compound the picture, the problems of the world are spirited into our homes through the miracle of television, computer, the phone, broadening our exposure to human frailties and natural and man-made disasters, from street crime and drugs to environmental insults and political intrigue on a national and global scale. Personally, I'm then besieged with requests for financial support from foundations seeking to address specific concerns, from the American Cancer Society, American Lung Association, Alzheimer's Foundation, to special interest groups defending rainforests, dolphins, and whales. I then carefully select my concerns, choosing perhaps one or two causes where I can place my efforts and make a donation now and then, letting the others slip uneasily into the background noise of my life. For me personally, it's not so much that any one problem seems insurmountable, but that all of them together can feel overwhelming. The good news is that although we compartmentalize our studies and personal and social problems and draw distinctions between them, the laws governing nature do not. The fire that inflames many of our ills is lit from a single match: our adversarial approach to life, and what appear to be diverse problems share a common solution: shifting our point of view. Natural laws are invisible. They're weightless. They're timeless patterns of behavior. So in that sense, they are always predictable. Natural laws work in tandem, and they make up just one force that infuses all creation. For a brief moment, I'd like to look at legislated versus natural laws. Do they have anything to do with each other than basically they're called laws? Or is this just a play on words? Well, in the words of author and playwright George Bernard Shaw, playing with words is like playing with mere dynamite. Words influence our perceptions, and our perceptions determine our actions. So I'd like to show a brief list of both legislated and natural laws and the parallels between them. With legislated laws, there is a goal, and it's to establish order through enforcement of law. With natural laws, order is inherent, and we use that order to achieve our goals. It's our beginning point, not our goal. Legislated laws, they're created. They're often ambiguous. Natural laws are not created. They are discovered to have always existed. Written laws are drawn up, they're revised, they're struck from the books. Natural laws are eternal. They never change, but they govern change. Legislated laws can and often are violated. But it's important to appreciate that it is impossible to violate natural laws. But when these laws are ignored, misapplied, misunderstood, they violate us. We then regard them and nature as forces hostile to our well-being. The great misunderstanding. Legislated laws are subject to the political winds of change and people's whims. Natural laws are not affected by public sentiment. And finally, legislated laws are adversarial in nature, coming from the Greek adversus, meaning to be against. Natural laws represent a non-adversarial system of order. When natural laws are correctly understood and applied, a plurality of physical, environmental, even social ills respond favorably and spontaneously to the exact same corrective measures. Natural laws are perfect in nature, but imperfectly worked out by man. So I want to ask a question which might seem to have an obvious answer. Why do we consume organic foods over non-organic? And the response will be familiar and true. We don't want to ingest the poisons of our modern agricultural industries, the herbicides, the pesticides, the fungicides, the thousands of chemicals that are literally poured over our plants and into our soil. But there's actually a more fundamental reason why we should be eating organic foods. And we can thank this man for his work and his influence on the modern organic agriculture. During the first half of the 20th century, soil scientist Albert Howard discovered a secret to health through trial and error in his agricultural work for the British government throughout India and Singapore. He ignited the organic agricultural movement worldwide, and he was later knighted for his work, which is summed up in his two books, The Soil and Health and An Agricultural Testament. Sir Howard discovered and confirmed through his fieldwork the disease-resisting power of natural living soil. Observing that untouched forest and field required neither heavy dressings of fertilizer nor blankets of chemical sprays to maintain their health and fertility, Sir Howard created humus based upon a traditional Indian composting system called the Indori process. The process recreated the grades of soil found on a typical untouched, undisturbed forest floor. Plants cultivated in such soil naturally resisted disease. Sir Howard confirmed this time and time again by introducing numerous infectious diseases into his plant populations, but his cultivated plants remained disease-free. Now at that time, mid-20th century, 3 highly infectious diseases were plaguing cattle in India: rinderpest, septicemia, and foot and mouth disease. Howard had his cattle forage on plants grown in soil that had been nourished by his compost. He eventually exposed his herd to cattle that were clearly infected with these highly infectious diseases. Again, the diseases wouldn't take, and his cattle remained healthy and strong, while surrounding populations of cattle were decimated by these same diseases. His conclusion? The best defense against illness and disease is a strong immune system, in both plants as well as animals, including humans, and that natural resistance is passed along through the food chain. Sir Howard's work provided the inspiration for Lady Eve Balfour in England and J.I. Rodale, the founder of Rodale Press, Organic Gardening and Farming, and the beginning of organized organic agriculture throughout the Americas, Europe, and the Far East. But his work, that original message, has been lost. There is a fundamental difference between the quality of soil described and recreated by Sir Howard and what we commonly refer to as organic farming today. I spoke with a grandson of J.I. Rodale, who is actively involved in the organic agricultural movement in the United States. Now, while acknowledging Howard's influence on his grandfather and the organic movement worldwide, he himself was personally unaware of the discoveries Sir Howard made regarding the health of the soil and the natural resistance that inspired Rodale's founder. We haven't yet arrived at growing and consuming food that naturally resists disease, or tangibly benefiting from the consumption of such strengthening foods. Foods grown in such living soil create healthy and disease-resistant plants that in turn strengthen and protect the animals and people who feed upon them. This is literally health from the ground up. Natural farming cycle, and what happens when we interrupt that cycle by the introduction of chemicals, and the results being of what we euphemistically describe as the side effects of improper technologies. I wanted to study the effects of conventional agriculture on a region, any region, of the United States. So I opened an atlas, closed my eyes, and randomly chose one spot on the map. My finger settled upon the Susquehanna River Basin leading into the Chesapeake Bay, located in the mid-Atlantic United States. The photo on the right shows the silt flowing down the Susquehanna River into the Chesapeake Bay as a result of improper farming practices. Chemicals used in agriculture today are ubiquitous. So where to begin? It would be impossible to describe or even understand the effects of these chemicals in their totality, So in order to gain an appreciation for the deleterious effects of these chemicals, I decided to choose just one, and that one is likely the most innocuous of them all: the addition of nitrogen found in standard commercial fertilizers. Chemical farming methods break the natural rhythms and regenerative effects of soil replenishment, and it begins to break down soil, then plant, then animal health. The following illustration tracks what happens when just that one artificial input, nitrogen, is added to the soil. It offers a visual of the cascading nature of side effects and how our adversarial response and approach to addressing these side effects creates even more, giving us the impression that controlling these problems is, well, frankly, out of our control. But nothing could be further from the truth. So what happens when you take that natural farming cycle and you introduce, say, just nitrogen in the Susquehanna River Basin near the Chesapeake Bay? The first level of side effects includes a drop in organic matter, which releases carbon into the atmosphere, killing off of diverse soil ecology, which lowers the quality of nutrition for the crops, and I'll return to that later. The contamination of underground aquifers, the killing off of the striped bass population, blue crab population, oyster beds, also bottom-dwelling sea life, including shrimp, an increase in algae blooms. Nitrogen causes the nitrification of wells, which causes blue baby syndrome in infants, which is a heart defect, and nitrosamines in adult digestive tracts. And also, nitrogen is the largest contributor to the atmospheric gas N2O, or nitrous oxide, which has a heat trapping capacity 300 times that of CO2. But that's just the first level of side effects. What happens when this continues unabated? Side effects yield side effects of their own. So the contamination of underground aquifers yields health effects upon people drawing groundwater. The killing off of diverse soil ecology lowers the quality of nutrition for the crops. And as Sir Albert Howard discovered, the lowered immune response invites pathogens to feed off of this weakened and decaying tissue. That's the duty, that's the role of pathogens in nature. But we don't see it that way. We take an adversarial response to that. So what is our response? The application of herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides, which will yield further side effects of their own. It's harmful for human and animal consumption. It further compromises the health of plants. It triggers mutation and adaptation of pathogens, which requires ever more toxic chemical applications. Again, we see this in an adversarial way. We could return to our natural farming methods, but instead we continue on this path of self-sabotage. So when the application of herbicides triggers mutation and adaptation of pathogens, our response is the introduction of genetically modified seed. It secretes its own pesticides, or it's resistant to other chemicals that are used in agriculture, such as Roundup Ready. What are the side effects of doing that? Well, the killing of beneficial insect populations, including the bee population. Loss of plant and animal diversity. There's genetic drift, which crossbreeds with non-GMO seeds and organic seed. It's the creation of superweeds and superviruses. Genetically modified seed lowers nutrient values in plants. It triggers further mutation and adaptation of pathogens. It contributes to soil toxicity. It contributes to the extinction of seed varieties. And yet, the side effects continue to roll out. We respond by creating stronger, more potent GM seeds and crops. The soil toxicity from these seeds leaches into groundwater, consumed by aquatic life, animals, and humans. The preceding illustrations offer only a partial listing of the side effects of introducing the nitrogen component in commercial fertilizer in the Susquehanna River Basin and its effect downstream as it drains into the Chesapeake Bay. Side effects yield side effects that yield further side effects ad infinitum. And here's the bad news. We cannot fix side effects. That is to say, how can you fix blue baby syndrome? Corrective heart surgery, I suppose, during the first few precious days of life, and pray that it succeeds. How do you fix the decimation of the fishing industry and the tearing apart of the social fabric of families and communities? SNAP benefits, soup kitchens, food pantries. How do you fix the production and release of heat-trapping nitrous oxide into the atmosphere? How do you fix the genetic drift of genetically modified seed? You can't fix side effects, although you wouldn't know that by observing the efforts of the many dozens of organizations, thousands of people, millions of dollars dedicated annually to address these concerns in just this one bioregion, addressing simply the addition of nitrogen. But it appears to be little more than triage than anything else, preoccupied with addressing only the symptoms, the side effects, if you will, of imperfect farming and agricultural practices. The bad news is we cannot fix side effects. The good news is that we don't have to. Stop the hemorrhaging. Go back to the source. Remove the chemicals. Reintroduce natural farming methods. As you do that, you break those first links that create the cascading side effects. And when you do that, stop the hemorrhaging. Return to the source. Remove the chemical inputs. Reestablish the natural farming cycle. As you do that, you break those initial links, the initial side effects of that improper technology. And as you do that, all of these problems will begin to diminish simultaneously across the board. A plurality of ills will respond favorably to the exact same corrective measures. We don't always have to choose our battles. Sometimes we have to change our point of view. So what does it take to motivate us? Isn't this enough? In terms of commerce, returning to natural farming practices, perfecting our technologies to align with natural principles. In terms of commerce, it'll be the creation of millions of new jobs, the creation of entirely new industries, new exports. With health and human services, we can create a strategy for reclaiming our air, our water, our food, which will dramatically reduce illness and the expense related to environmental health measures. In terms of the Treasury, a cost-benefit analysis would reveal that billions of dollars spent annually on medical care related to the burning of fossil fuels, cleanup costs related to environmental degradation, the hundreds of billions of dollars spent annually keeping this country on a war footing to ensure our access to foreign oil, and the cost associated with maintaining the tools of industries that are based upon antiquated 19th century technology. In terms of foreign policy and national security, weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels will, for the first time in memory, free up a Secretary of State to shepherd a foreign policy guided by humanitarian considerations rather than pursuing our primary concern for oil at all costs, who would act as a broker for peace instead of an apologist for war. So why do we resist implementing such positive change? How can we be so stubborn? Well, let's start with a quiz. Can you identify the following country? It must satisfy all, not just some, of the following criteria. This country is the world's leading manufacturer and exporter of airplanes, steel, appliances, automobiles. It is not only energy independent, But this country is the world's largest producer and the world's largest exporter of oil. It's so large, in fact, that it alone determines the price of oil on the world market. And finally, this country is not only a creditor nation, but the world's largest creditor. Now, this is, in a sense, a trick question, because what country today can boast of such sweeping economic power? The answer, though, is the United States. Well, from the early 1950s to the mid-1960s. Now, many people of my generation and older directly experienced this part of recent American history, and many of us are nostalgic for those times, which were far simpler. Many members of my generation and older wish to return to those days of American superiority, and really, who can blame them? Those were, after all, heady times, and they feel threatened that people today wish to steal their version of the American dream. They'd be correct in that assumption. These older Americans are nostalgic, and they're forever looking back over their shoulders while evolution is unyielding in its progression through time. But there's a new version of the American dream, one that embraces renewable technologies that will not only create a wealth of new jobs, but entirely new industries and exports, and will at the same time reverse the decades-long destruction of our soil, water, air, food, and personal health, which will reduce healthcare costs, improve overall quality of life, while curbing emissions that we have given rise to global warming and climate change, which, in turn, as the Pentagon points out, will strengthen national security. Again, the beauty of this is that a plurality of environmental, social, political, and physical ills will respond favorably to the same corrective measures. It would be nothing short of an American Renaissance, and it waits only for our collective will to express itself socially and politically. It's a gift, compliments of evolution, and one that we have yet to accept, and the consequences of not accepting it are fatal. Why do we resist implementing such positive change? Evolution shaped the human brain to be acutely aware of all potential dangers. This is what ensured our survival. This has a profound effect on human perception. It literally shuts off our ability to take in good news. So let me offer you some good news. Let's start with the science of biomimicry. Biomimicry is a practice that learns from and mimics the strategies found in nature to solve human-designed challenges. Here's just one example. Scientists were of the opinion that zebras could not live where they do because it's simply too hot. So they had to figure out why, in fact, they can live there. And the answer was in their stripes. Now, you and I know that we'll wear warm colors, dark colors in the winter to absorb light, and whites, such as tennis whites, in the summer to reflect the heat. So the temperature difference between the dark and white stripes on a zebra can be as much as 10 degrees. So you have a warmer stripe followed by a cooler stripe, by a warmer stripe, by a cooler stripe, etc. Now the air just off the surface of these stripes will likewise be of different temperatures. The dark stripes will create warmer air. The white stripes, cooler air. So you've got warmer air, cooler air, warmer air, cooler air. What this does is it creates a difference in pressure between the air over the stripes, which creates movement, a disturbance, if you will. And what happens is the air then sweeps over the body of the zebra, acting as a natural air conditioner. So in terms of biomimicry, how can we make use of this? So we could apply this technology to, say, buildings, not creating black and white buildings, but buildings with different composites to both reflect and absorb light, which would create a temperature differential, which would create movement of air around the outside of the building, which could be channeled inside of the building for natural air conditioning. Two more examples of biomimicry. It's known that in the United States, approximately 1 billion birds lose their lives each year flying into window panes. The same can be said in Europe. Again, approximately 1 billion birds. But researchers notice something curious in forests. There are many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of spider webs throughout forests, and birds are known to dart in and out quite quickly between branches and trees, and they never, ever fly into spider webs. The reason why is the filaments of a spider web reflect a certain bandwidth of light that the birds can see, and so the birds quite naturally avoid it. So, for instance, there's a window maker in Germany who's creating windows, and he's inserting in these windows filaments that neither you nor I can see, but they mimic the filaments of a spider web that radiate a spectrum of light that the birds can see and therefore avoid. Then there's the paper wasp nest. When I'm teaching school children biomimicry, I ask the teacher's permission if I can give the kids some homework. There's always an audible groan from the kids, of course, but then I quickly add that I'm going to give them 20 years to do it. And the assignment is to figure out how the paper wasp creates paper that is windproof and waterproof that you can actually write on using only their saliva and dead wood. Humans use approximately 300 chemicals in the making of white paper. But paper wasps can do it again with just saliva and dead wood, no new growth. Some more good news. Buckminster Fuller observed that all of life's biological processes on Earth, including those of humans, manage to capture and use 1/1,000,000th of 1% of all the energy that washes over this planet. Folks, we're just getting started. We're still quite primitive. We still have a tailbone to show for it. Enough sunlight falls on the Earth's surface every hour to meet the entire world's energy needs for 1 year. A plot roughly 100 miles by 100 miles in the American Southwest, if covered with today's industry standard 15 to 20% efficient solar panels, could generate enough power for the entire United States. So, okay, we're not going to find a plot 100 by 100 miles, but why not 10 plots that are 10 miles by 10 miles? It's easily achievable. It just requires collective will. Based on a study by the European Solar Thermal Electricity Association and Greenpeace International, technically, it would only take 2% of the solar energy from the Sahara Desert to supply the world's electricity needs. 0.3% would power all of Europe. IBM solar collectors magnify the sun by 2,000 times. The process of trapping the sunlight also produces water that can be used to produce filtered, drinkable water. Using today's technology, we can erect in space solar arrays that can beam 5 gigawatts back to Earth. Critics of solar energy say, oh, it's great to harness the power of the sun, but the sun isn't always shining. Well, it is. You just need to get above the clouds and have these installations circling the Earth. Again, each one beaming 5 gigawatts back to Earth for our use. The technology exists. IBM has created solar curtains for the home. Close the curtains and power up your home for the day when you go to work. 33-foot wind turbines are being produced that will be able to produce 30% more energy than their 300-foot cousins. In the U.S., wind energy is producing energy equivalent to that produced by 15 nuclear power plants. And it generated 6.5% of the nation's electricity in 2018, enough energy to power 26 million homes. In the United States, the geothermal energy within 2 miles of the Earth's surface, and that's how far we go now for deep fracking of natural gas. The geothermal energy within 2 miles of the Earth's surface is approximately 3 million quads, which is enough energy to provide for America's needs for 30,000 years. That's not a typo. 30,000 years. The quaint Tesla Model S. There's lots of cars being produced, and there'll be more in the near future based upon this concept. Supercharger. The powers the Tesla is solar powered. The graphic to the lower right is quite quaint. From October 2012, there were 5 or 6 charging stations for the Tesla. They were all in California. Well, 6 years later, the U.S. had approximately 57,000 charging outlets and 20,000 charging stations for plug-in electric vehicles. The biophotovoltaic panel. A biophotovoltaic panel installed at the Valdora campus of the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia. It consists of a battery that produces energy from bacteria in the soil around it. The bacteria break down plant nutrients to release electrons that are used to create an electrical current. Portland, Oregon residents can now generate green electricity simply by turning on their water taps and flushing their toilets. Portland is using a state-of-the-art system to capture energy from water flowing through the city's pipelines. Small turbines installed inside the pipelines are turned by the flowing water, sending energy into a generator and off into the power grid. May 8, 2016, Germany produced so much renewable energy that output exceeded demand. Prices went negative, so consumers were paid to consume energy. Literally power to the people. Michigan State has come up with a crystal clear solar concentrator that can be integrated into anything with a clear surface, from your iPhone screen to the windows of your house, to gather energy without blocking your view. Paper-thin printed solar cells could provide power for 1.3 billion people. It requires only an industrial printer to manufacture and are inexpensive to produce. And they've gone from 3% to 20% efficiency in just 3 years. So look, how do we accelerate these wonderful changes, since the technology is already adequate to the task and just getting better and more efficient, and minimizing, if not eliminating altogether, the side effects that cause climate change? Why do we resist implementing such positive change? Buckminster Fuller observed that humans do the right things, but for the wrong reasons. Why? Well, evolution shaped the human brain to be acutely aware of all potential dangers. Fear and our survival instinct, especially during times of conflict and war, have historically accelerated the development of technology, the applications of which would eventually find peacetime use. An example, in 2011, the Defense Department's HTV-2 bomber prototype plunged into the Pacific Ocean, but not before reaching a speed of Mach 20, 15,200 miles per hour. The inspiration for this technology is fear-based, to allow military aircraft to reach any military hotspot on the globe within an hour. Once developed, though, this technology would eventually find peacetime use, and at that speed, an aircraft could fly us from New York to LA in under 9 minutes, while wreaking havoc in our circadian rhythms. We'd also be able to fly medical aid to anywhere on the globe within 60 minutes. We are developing the right technology, but for the wrong reasons. And then there was the benign-sounding space race of the 1960s. On October 4, 1957, the Russians successfully launched the Sputnik satellite into orbit, the first man-made object to circle the globe. Even though Sputnik was only capable of beaming signals back to Earth, its presence in space scared the bejeebers out of Americans, military and civilians alike. We were in a Cold War with the Russians, and their technological superiority was sobering. Americans envisioned Russian missiles posed overhead in orbit. Now, NASA managed to successfully send a chimpanzee on a non-orbital flight in January 1961, but just 3 months later, the Russians again outdid the U.S. by successfully launching cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit and returning him safely to Earth. The U.S. was feeling the pressure to accelerate its program in order to catch up with Russian technology and perceived Russian superiority. 3 weeks later, it was America's turn to attempt a manned flight. We were to use the Redstone rocket to boost a capsule into the sky. This rocket was initially developed for wartime use, Korean War, and was developed under the tutelage of NASA's Wernher von Braun, who helped develop and build the Nazi V-2 missile. Again, wartime aggression serving as the impetus for rocket development. There were a series of failed test flights, including one where the Redstone managed to lift only 4 inches off the launch pad before returning with a thud. The photo on the right shows another failed attempt. The rocket failed to launch, the flight was aborted, and the purpose of the rockets that you see lighting were to lift what would have been a manned capsule at the top of the rocket up and away from the booster in case it was to explode. Well, as you can see, the rockets fired successfully. Unfortunately, it forgot to take the capsule with it. Finally, though, the day arrived for astronaut Alan Shepard to attempt space flight. After hours on the launch pad, it did successfully take off. It flew in an arc from Cape Canaveral, Florida, to just north of the Bahamas. The chutes deployed, the capsule drifted down, splashed into the Atlantic, where Shepard was fished from the water by a helicopter. Now, the launch amounted to only a 15-minute suborbital flight, but it was considered a technological miracle. Shepard found his face on the postage stamp. He was paraded down Lower Manhattan in a ticker tape parade, and just 2 weeks later, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and committed the nation's resources to sending astronauts to the moon and back before the end of the decade. Now, was the president's commitment premature and overly ambitious? If you were to have asked even those test pilots who were eventually to walk upon the surface of the moon, it was nothing less than science fiction and fanciful thinking. It was assumed to be technologically impossible to land on the moon and return safely to Earth within that frame of time. Policy wonks, researchers, scientists believed the president wasn't actually serious about achieving this goal. Instead, he was simply attempting to bolster America's pride in the face of Russia's achievements. But in the months that immediately followed, 400,000 people in the private and public sectors worked collaboratively on a shared goal. As Buckminster Fuller observed, over 500,000 new artifacts and materials would need to be invented and developed during that time, including materials previously unknown to man. The result? The mission was achieved ahead of schedule. Now, here's the thing. What we as Americans were able to accomplish in those few years was far more ambitious and technologically challenging than the obstacles facing us today in developing and deploying clean, renewable technologies in order to halt the progression of climate change. The technology has in fact already been developed. But what was the incentive back in the 1960s? Fear, of course, fear of Russian superiority and domination. We mobilized and developed all the right technology swiftly, but for the wrong reasons. The Cold War technology developed during the space race did find its way into peacetime use. Satellite, television, laptops, telemedicine, the joystick, 3D graphics, virtual reality, satellite navigation, artificial limbs, anti-icing system solar cells, structural analysis software. Can something other than fear create the right incentive for the swift development and deployment of right technologies? The Pentagon even had tried appealing to fear when it declared climate change to be the greatest threat to America's national security, but it fell on politicians' deaf ears. Humans seem unable to grasp the unprecedented notion of extinction of its own species as motivation to mobilize and deploy. One of the ways of learning to see differently going forward is to begin developing the right technology for the right reasons, which is to further the promotion of global health and peace. The fourth thing we need to do is to learn to see differently. We remain creatures dependent upon our five senses. What this means is that once upon a time, we could rely on our senses to save us from approaching dangers, whether it was an approaching storm or an approaching horse and carriage. We'd know enough through sight and sound to step out of the way. But with the Industrial Revolution, with the ever swifter development of technologies in the 20th and 21st century, most of the things that now present danger to our health and our very lives are beyond our senses, our immediate senses to perceive. So we must literally learn to see differently. The fifth reason why we resist implementing positive change: deliberate misinformation. The author on the right, E.B. White, author of Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, and essays throughout his life. In 1938, a decade before the advent of commercial television in America, was shown a demonstration of its use. And this is what he had to say about it. I believe television, and by extension the computer and internet, is going to be the test of the modern world, and that in this new opportunity to see beyond the range of our vision, we'll discover either a new and unbearable disturbance of the general peace, or a saving radiance in the sky. We shall stand or fall by television, of that I am quite sure. Well, I believe the jury is still out on this. Television has proven to be a blessing and a curse, and we have yet to realize its full potential. At best, television exposes us to a spectrum of world cultures, history, and current events, nature and the environment, and good, clean fun and entertainment. It can educate and inspire. Together we watched a live telecast as a man stepped off a lunar module and onto the surface of the moon. At worst, and most often, television robs our children and adults of our imagination, numbs us to the effects of violence, undermines our sense of safety and security, and serves as a role model for aggressive and violent behavior. As just one example, by the time a child reaches the first grade, she or he will have watched 30,000 television commercials and witnessed 8,000 acts of violence on television and video games at a time when their brains are being hardwired. I turned on the TV the other day and channel surfed. 80% of what I saw dealt with and glorified violence, from crime and horror shows to superheroes, something for all ages. The violence of the top video games is horrific, from Battlefield Hardline to Bloodborne to hatred. The premise of hatred, and I quote here, players act out the role of a sociopath who attempts to kill innocent bystanders and police officers with guns, flamethrowers, and bombs to satisfy his hatred of humanity. Blood and gore is rampant, as are characters begging for mercy before they're executed, frequently during profanity-laced rants. Close quotation. Recommended viewing? Of course, 10-year-olds and up. When it comes to educating the public on the value and promise of 21st century renewable technologies, television has played a central role in deliberately misinforming the public and stalling, even reversing, progress. Plutocracy and the disinformation campaign. Now it can be said that corporations possess a strong survival instinct and will do whatever is required to survive, if not thrive. The captains of these industries are responsible to their shareholders to maximize their profit, and at all costs, even at the cost of truth. Here's but one example. Now, the scientific research regarding the effects of fossil fuel technologies on climate change is firmly established. The financial security of traditional fossil fuel-driven energy conglomerates is threatened by the specter of climate change and the rapid and accelerating advancements in clean, renewable technologies. So the survival mechanism kicks in. Money pours in from individuals and organizations having a vested interest in the continuing use of antiquated fossil fuel technologies. They create what they call think tanks, with names only a little less ludicrous than the Institute to Debunk Climate Change. These pseudo-scientific institutes are filled with people who possess PhDs but no moral compass, and they skewer the scientific data. The altered research they produce is aired as legitimate news on television and radio stations throughout the United States. Europe flatly rejects it. And since this is a presentation on climate change, I would just throw in a nature photo for entertainment. Now, not coincidentally, these networks are owned and controlled by the same good people who control the fossil fuel industries, through interlocking directorates or outright ownership. The news is fear-based. Fear of loss of jobs. Fear that renewable technologies are not adequate to the task. Fear about losing the nostalgic dream of American supremacy fueled by oil, coal, and gas. Fear of change of this magnitude. This disinformation influences the opinions of millions of voters who inform themselves almost exclusively on these news outlets. With their opinions formed, viewers look toward their representatives to represent their interests on climate change and the pushback against renewable technologies. Who then are these viewers going to vote for in state and federal elections? To answer this question, we need to consider the following. How much does it cost to buy a seat in Congress? Using data from the 2012 election cycle, House members, on average, each raised $1,689,000. Senators, on average, each raised from $10.5 million to $14.5 million in order to buy their seat. The cost of buying an election have increased dramatically since then. Now, representatives and those aspiring to the position have to rely heavily on the largesse of corporate donors to fund their campaigns. In a word, they become beholden to them. By default, those millions of viewers who feed almost exclusively on junk science will support those candidates bankrolled by the corporate giants who own the fossil fuel technologies, the airwaves, and eventually the candidates themselves who espouse the interests of their benefactors. Now, it's been made abundantly clear by former representatives that their colleagues, despite their seemingly different ideologies, do acknowledge both the existence of climate change and the role that fossil fuel technologies play in it. It's just that they cannot afford to defend that position if they wish to bankroll their campaigns, or so they believe. Now, combined with the perfected arts of gerrymandering and voter suppression, the disinformation campaign has effectively undermined American progress in the rapid development and deployment of clean, renewable technologies. The United States stagnates, while virtually all other industrialized countries seize upon these new opportunities, especially China, which spends trillions on renewable research and development, while the United States spends trillions on war materiel. As is readily recognized by now, there are financial and political constraints in place in our country that benefit the interests of the few and the wealthy. It is of fundamental importance to understand that a plutocracy not only owes no allegiance to our government or to any form of government, but that it profits enormously from our misfortunes, from our dependence upon fossil fuels to profiting from the lucrative federal contracts to fight wars over it. The effects of climate change? When we go to the halls of Congress to sound alarms over the disastrous consequences of climate change, what many of our representatives hear is opportunity. Profits to be made from desalination plants, the purchasing of water rights, increased private security contracts, the development and monopolization of genetically modified crops, and increased social unrest worldwide that will require a security response, including war materiel. When we voice our concerns about the high incarceration rate in the United States, do our representatives hear this as a cause for alarm or, again, opportunity? Incarceration is big business. Private prisons are a $5 billion industry annually and growing. Quotas are established to fill the cells. Incarceration lines the pockets of the plutocracy. Misfortune is profitable. So in the end, what is a single person to do? We don't live in a protected bubble, but there are steps we can take to improve quality of life in our homes and businesses, communities, and planet. The first thing we can do is enjoy a diet that supports sustainable farming practices, which promotes the health and vitality of the soil, plants, animals, and humans. Adopt a plant-based diet. Minimize or eliminate altogether foods that are not perfectly suited for human consumption: meat, dairy, food additives, preservatives, colorings, and the like. Find your passion points and organize with like-minded people. It was Manly Hall who said that a person learns that his integrity as an individual moves most rapidly and successfully in the direction of his own highest convictions. Trust them. Listen to yourself and trust them. The 3.5% rule. How a small minority can and has changed the world. Looking at hundreds of campaigns over the last century, Harvard researcher and professor Erica Chenoweth found that nonviolent campaigns are twice as likely to achieve their goals as violent campaigns. And most importantly, although the exact dynamics will depend on many factors, she has shown that it takes around 3.5% of the population in any given movement actively participating in the protests to ensure even serious political change. We don't need to change the world. We don't need to convince everybody. We just need to organize with that 3.5% critical mass that can tip the balance. We have been appealing to leadership, political leadership and the captains of industry and technology, appealing to their better nature. But I believe the time has come to instead compel them. The only way to effect swift and meaningful change is to practice civil disobedience. So we should prepare ourselves to leave our comfort zones to do that. There are 25 global companies that produce 80% of the pollution that contributes to climate change. We need to target them financially. We need to boycott. Money is the one language they understand and respond to. Don't appeal to them, compel them. There is strength in numbers. Effect change, even if it feels at first to be of little consequence. Even incremental changes in habit and lifestyle can produce profound changes over time. As is commonly understood among mariners, the shift of just a few degrees at the beginning of a voyage can mean a vastly different direction and destination far out at sea. Don't underestimate the power and influence of your everyday choices. Humans are quite simply a work in progress. Whenever we speak of evolution, we make the mistake of restricting its meaning to the past tense, something that has occurred. What comes to mind is fossilized evidence, things old and partial, trapped in stone, until exposed to sunlight and dusted clean with an archaeologist's brush. These fragments often reveal species of life that died out ages ago, having been unable to respond to social and environmental pressures. We shouldn't restrict our understanding of evolution to past events. We must also consider future possibilities. Although it's written in the Bible that God created man in his image, I can't help but think that over the past 3,000 years, during its travels from mother tongue to modern languages, something subtle was lost in the translations. And the words originally written said that God is creating man and woman in his image. Humans are quite simply that work in progress. So today we find ourselves at a critical juncture in our evolution, where our technological achievements have, until recently, outpaced our understanding of the science and the side effects behind them. After all, it was easier to burn a piece of coal than to understand the science behind it, where our technological evolution continues to outpace the social evolution that is required to embrace these new technologies and use them for the common good. Mathematician, philosopher, scientist, and inventor Arthur Young wrote that, quote, "Evolution requires a current against which to swim. The river of time carries us along, but it is only by our own effort that we evolve." Close quotation. The challenges facing us today are not technical in nature. They are social and, more importantly, personal. It was inevitable that humans, as an evolving species, arrive at this point in time. The question remains if we will be able to navigate these waters and make it successfully to the other shore, or will our bones and our buildings be reduced to fossilized evidence of a species that chose not to respond quickly enough to the environmental and social pressures we ourselves created. This opportunity for unprecedented technological change and prosperity presents itself to us courtesy of evolution. It's done its part. Now we must do ours.